You wake to the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, each strike echoing through the night like the drumbeat of war. The air is heavy, carrying the sharp tang of smoldering olive oil lamps, the musk of sweat, and the faint, rancid breath of the Tiber River as it snakes through Rome's darkened heart. It is 48 AD, the dead of night, and you find yourself crouched in a shadowed alcove of the imperial palace. Your back presses against cool marble, rough tunic snagging against jagged stone, as though even the palace itself wishes to hold you in place to silence you. Beyond the silk curtains, thin, ghost-like veils swaying with the draft, comes a murmur, laughter laced with secrets, gasps drawn out like sighs of lovers, the clink of goblets raised in whispered conspiracies. It is the music of a world denied to you, the world of nobles and emperors, a stage on which you will never stand yet are forced to witness. Your pulse races. You are only a servant, invisible in their eyes, but close enough to overhear words that could shatter lives. Then, through the haze of torchlight and shadow, you see her. Valeria Messalina, the Empress of Rome, moving swiftly beneath a hooded cloak. Her face is half-shrouded, but her eyes gleam with a reckless fire, an intensity that seems capable of setting the very empire aflame. She is too young, too beautiful, too dangerous, and even cloaked, her presence is unmistakable. You shrink deeper into the alcove. Fear coils in your stomach like a serpent. You know that one misstep, one whispered word of what you've seen, and the Praetorian Guard's blades will find you before the dawn spills its first light over the Palatine Hill. Rome is a city that rewards silence and punishes knowledge. But the palace itself seems alive tonight, its marble halls breathing with tension. The torchlight flickers, casting long shadows across mosaics of gods who watch silently, their painted eyes bright with judgment. The stones beneath you are cold, but your skin burns as if the very heat of Messalina's desire and ambition has seeped into the walls. She disappears into the darkness, leaving behind the faint rustle of her cloak, a whisper of defiance. You exhale, slowly, as though daring to breathe too loudly might summon death. Tonight is only the beginning, and what follows will not simply shape your fate, but the fate of Rome itself. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Gather closer now. Let the fire crackle and cast its light upon the tale. We are not unrolling dusty scrolls but entering a world alive with grit and grandeur. The streets thick with the smell of sweat and bread, the palaces perfumed with roses and poison. This is Rome at its most dazzling and most decayed. And at the center of this storm stands Valeria Messalina, Empress, seductress, predator, whose name became a byword for scandal, and whose shadow stretched over those forgotten souls, the delicati, the young concubines, whose silent suffering was as common as bread baked in the Subura's ovens. The night trembles with her secret and the story begins. Valeria Messalina was born around 20 AD, in a Rome that seemed eternal, its arches, temples and aqueducts carved into stone as if the city itself were destined to defy time. But for all its grandeur, Rome was also a city of shadows, where ambition cut deeper than any sword. Messalina's bloodline carried both privilege and peril, a heritage entwined with power like ivy climbing the ancient walls of the Palatine. Her father, Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, was no minor noble. He had worn the consul's robes, his family name etched into the Republic's legacy of triumphs. In their atrium stood wax masks of ancestors, the Imagens Maiorum, their hollow eyes fixed in eternal remembrance, reminding each generation of duty, triumph, and ambition. A child growing up in such a house could not escape the weight of expectation. She would have felt it in the silence of those staring faces, pressing upon her as heavily as the summer heat on terracotta rooftops. Her mother, Domitia Lepida the Younger, was a woman bound by her own entanglements of power. She was the sister of Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, father of Nero, and cousin to Caligula himself. Through Lepida, the blood of emperors pulsed faintly in Messalina's veins. It was a dangerous inheritance. To be tied by kinship to such volatile rulers was to dance upon a precipice. One misstep could send a family tumbling into exile or worse into the grave. Messalina's earliest years unfolded in palatial gardens where fountains arced in dazzling sprays, droplets scattering rainbows across laurel hedges. She would have watched slaves move silently across mosaic floors, their bare feet whispering against stone as they carried trays of figs and honeyed wine. The Subura's scent of baked bread and sewage drifted faintly on the breeze from the Tiber, a reminder that Rome's magnificence was built upon the sweat and suffering of the unseen. As a child, Messalina might have run her fingers along frescoed walls, tracing painted nymphs dancing with satyrs. Their eyes, almost alive, seemed to follow her, a silent education in desire and consequence. In whispered conversations among senators' wives, she would have overheard fragments of intrigue, hints of alliances formed in marriage beds and destroyed in the Senate's marble chambers. Childhood in Rome's aristocracy was no gentle dream. It was a schooling in suspicion, ambition, and survival. Imagine her at 10 years old, walking hand in hand with her mother beneath pergolas heavy with grapevines, while senators bowed politely, their eyes calculating. Even as a girl, she was a political token, her beauty and lineage already bargaining chips in the unending game of dynastic power. The lessons came early. Silence could protect, a glance could betray, and every word had weight. For most children, memory is filled with games and laughter. For Messalina, memory was filled with politics. The smell of parchment and ink from her father's study, the sharp tones of her mother whispering with allies, and the cold gaze of masks watching from the atrium walls. Power was not a distant idea, it was the air she breathed. Rome itself was a paradox that Messalina absorbed from birth. Marble splendor raised upon the bones of slaves, temples to gods built alongside brothels and prisons, virtue paraded in public while vice thrived in private. The city whispered one lesson again and again, that survival belonged not to the strong alone, but to the cunning. This was the soil in which Messalina grew. Not merely the daughter of a consul and a noblewoman, but the child of a family steeped in ambition, tied to emperors, and bound to the dangerous currents of Rome's politics. Her beauty would make her visible, her lineage would make her valuable, and her hunger would make her unforgettable. The girl wandering gardens and mosaicked halls was already being prepared for a stage far grander, and far deadlier, than she could imagine. By the year 38 AD, Rome was a furnace of ambition, and Messalina, barely 18, was about to be thrust into the fire. Her match was not born of romance but of calculation, the sort of marriage that welded families together with chains of blood and obligation. Her husband was Tiberius Claudius Drusus. Claudius, nearly 50 years old, more than twice her age, and already a man worn by years of humiliation at the fringes of Rome's elite. Claudius was no ordinary groom. To the aristocracy, he was a figure of mockery. His limp, his stammer, the awkward droop of his mouth made him an object of scorn at banquets and whispered jests in the Senate. Yet what others dismissed as weakness had kept him alive. While his kin fell victim to conspiracies and daggers in shadowed corridors, Claudius had survived by burying himself in scholarship. His hands were often ink-stained, his nights spent in scrolls of history while the rest of the imperial family played their deadly games. In obscurity he endured, and in that endurance, perhaps, lay Rome's most unlikely emperor. The wedding itself was a spectacle, not a union of hearts. Priests intoned solemn chants beneath a canopy of silken fabric heavy with the scent of incense. Senators and matrons in embroidered togas whispered from the shadows, weighing alliances like merchants counting coin. The air was thick with calculation. This marriage was not simply between a young girl and a frail scholar, but between dynasties. Messalina's beauty and lineage lent Claudius legitimacy. Claudius's name and status elevated Messalina's family. Each guest saw not vows of love, but a binding of ambition. If Messalina's heart rebelled at being tethered to this stammering man, she concealed it well. To Rome's aristocracy, obedience was a virtue more valuable than desire. And Claudius, for all his awkwardness, brought power within reach. Though few guessed it then, this union would place Messalina at the heart of the empire. The marriage bore fruit quickly. Within a year she gave birth to Claudia Octavia, a fragile infant swaddled in linens dyed with Tyrian purple, her dark eyes searching and watchful even in the cradle. 2 years later, in 41 AD, came Britannicus, Tiberius Claudius Germanicus, born in a Rome on the brink of chaos. The cries of the newborn mingled with the whispers of conspiracy in the palace halls. For Messalina, motherhood and ambition intertwined. She was no passive empress to be but a woman already calculating how to secure her children's future in a world where bloodlines could be blessings one moment and death warrants the next. Each birth strengthened her hold on Claudius, binding her to him not with love, but with heirs, tokens of legitimacy in a dynasty infamous for intrigue. Yet even as she swaddled her children, the empire was shifting beneath her feet. In 41 AD the thunderclap struck. Caligula, the mad emperor, was cut down by daggers in a palace corridor, his blood slicking the marble floors. In the chaos, soldiers stumbled upon Claudius, trembling behind a curtain, his breath shallow with terror. They dragged him out and, in a moment that seemed absurd to many, hailed him emperor. Messalina, at barely 21, suddenly found herself Empress of Rome. The girl raised among frescoes and whispers now wore a crown of laurel and shadow. Rome's fate and her own had shifted irreversibly. The year was 41 AD and the empire quaked. Caligula, the emperor who had once promised Rome a golden age but delivered only madness, lay butchered in a palace corridor. His assassins, members of the Praetorian Guard, had struck with brutal precision, their blades tearing into his body until marble was streaked with blood and torchlight flickered against crimson pools. The whispers of conspiracy turned to screams, and Rome found itself leaderless, its people teetering between jubilation and terror. Amid the chaos, soldiers scoured the palace. Curtains flapped in the draft of hurried footsteps, shadows twisted and torches smoked. Behind one such curtain they found him, Claudius. The uncle of Caligula, the man the Senate had long mocked as a half-wit, crouched in fear, limbs trembling, his mouth unable to form words. He had spent his life surviving by invisibility, now invisibility had failed him. The Praetorians dragged him out, but rather than run him through, they hailed him emperor. Not out of love or admiration but from cold calculation. Claudius, they thought, could be molded, guided, controlled. Better a frightened scholar on the throne than a vengeful Senate seizing power. In their armor, still slick with Caligula's blood, they lifted Claudius up as Rome's new ruler. The Senate balked. Senators, their faces pale in the lamplight, debated feverishly whether to reject Claudius, whether to restore the Republic. But fear of the mob and the Praetorian swords silenced their ambitions. Under pressure they confirmed him. Thus, with trembling lips and unsteady hands, Claudius became emperor of the known world. And with him rose Messalina. Barely 21 years old, she transformed overnight from noblewoman and wife to Augusta, Empress of Rome. She walked the same marble halls that had echoed with the madness of Caligula, her steps deliberate, her presence radiant and unsettling. Where Claudius embodied hesitation, Messalina embodied fire. The palace became her stage. Its corridors were lined with gilded frescoes of gods and lovers, but also with whispers of betrayal, of daggers hidden in folds of cloth, of women and men undone by ambition. Rome's imperial home was not merely a palace, it was a labyrinth of danger. And Messalina, young as she was, moved through it with the grace of a predator. At banquets, she laughed brightly, the sound of silver bells, but behind her eyes calculation flickered like flame. She learned quickly whom to charm, whom to fear, and whom to destroy. Claudius's freedmen, men like Narcissus and Pallas, once slaves, now secretaries wielding immense influence, became her allies. She understood that in a Rome where senators postured and soldiers schemed, it was these freedmen, overlooked by nobles, who held the keys to power. Through them she began to weave her net. Claudius himself, though underestimated, was no fool in matters of history. But in matters of court intrigue he leaned heavily on those around him. And in this reliance, Messalina saw her opening. She was not content to be an ornament beside her husband's throne. She would be its pulse. Tacitus would later describe her as a flame in a court of shadows, her ambition as sharp as any blade carried by the Praetorian Guard. And in these early years of Claudius's reign, the empire began to learn that the true danger did not lie in the emperor's stammer or his limp, but in the quiet, relentless hunger of the empress at his side. The imperial palace under Claudius was no sanctuary. It was a hive of whispers, a place where loyalty shifted like sand underfoot, and where a single rumor could weigh more heavily than an army of legionaries. Into this storm stepped Messalina, a woman scarcely more than 20 years old, but already sharpened by lineage, ambition, and a keen instinct for survival. To the outside world she was dazzling, her beauty remarked upon even by those who despised her. Her silks trailed lightly across mosaics of Venus and Adonis, her voice rang bright in the marble chambers, and her laughter spilled like wine. But beneath this charm lay calculation. Every gesture was a thread woven into a web of influence, each smile a mask hiding her predatory intent. She learned quickly that true power in Claudius's Rome did not rest in the Senate's curule chairs or in the Praetorian Guard's spears. It thrived in the shadows, in the pens of freedmen who drafted edicts, managed correspondence, and whispered into the emperor's ear. Narcissus, Claudius's secretary of correspondence, was a man of cold cunning, his gaze missing nothing. Pallas, the treasurer, held coffers richer than many senators. These men, once slaves, now wielded authority greater than most of Rome's nobility. To Messalina they were not beneath her, they were tools. With Narcissus she wove alliances through flattery and promise. With Pallas she traded influence for wealth, strengthening her hand in the Senate by rewarding allies and silencing rivals. To Rome's proud aristocracy, this reliance on freedmen was humiliating, but Messalina understood what they did not. That power was never about titles but access. She and the freedmen together became the hidden machinery of Claudius's rule. Tacitus, in his annals, observed her ambition with words edged in warning. He describes a mind sharpened like the daggers senators carried beneath their cloaks, always ready to strike, always cloaked in silk. In the flickering torchlight of the palace, Messalina became both seductress and spider, pulling men into her orbit only to bind them tighter in her schemes. But her influence was not confined to whispers in dimly lit corridors. Rome saw it in public too. Senators, once disdainful of her youth, began to tread carefully in her presence. Requests for favors, whispers for protection, offerings of loyalty, all flowed toward Messalina. She was no longer just the emperor's young wife, she was becoming the unspoken gatekeeper of power in the empire. And yet, beneath the polished marble of the palace, tension coiled. For in Rome, power was never held peacefully. It demanded blood, betrayal, and the constant sacrifice of others. Messalina's hands, still delicate and adorned with rings, would soon be stained with the first drops of that price. Power in Rome was not secured by smiles and silks alone. It was fed with blood, sharpened by betrayal, and tested in the cries of the condemned. Messalina, barely in her 20s, had already begun to understand this truth. And so, when desire was denied to her, she chose to answer with death. Her gaze had fallen upon Decimus Junius Silanus Torquatus, a senator of noble lineage and striking presence. He was the man she had arranged to be bound in marriage to her own mother, Domitia Lepida, a convenient arrangement that would have kept him tethered within her orbit. But when Messalina turned her eyes upon him with a hunger that mixed passion and calculation, he rebuffed her. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or disgust, Silanus refused to be drawn into her snares. For Messalina, rejection was not a wound to pride. It was a threat. To deny the Empress was to risk her wrath, and wrath was a luxury she could afford in abundance. The night of his undoing unfolded quietly, with no clash of swords, no public spectacle, only whispers. She leaned close to Narcissus, Claudius's trusted freedman, her voice low, urgent, and laced with venom. She spun a tale of treason, that Silanus, ambitious and proud, plotted in silence against the emperor himself. Tacitus recounts that Claudius, roused from slumber, pale-faced in the flickering light of a single lamp, was convinced by the freedman's urgent counsel. In that fragile midnight hour, a life was sealed. At dawn, the soldiers came for Silanus. He was dragged through streets still damp with morning dew, his cries echoing off the stone. No trial was granted, no defense allowed. By imperial order, he was executed swiftly, his blood staining the Gemonian stairs, the grim, cursed steps where the bodies of traitors were flung for the city to see. The people of Rome, used to violence yet never numb to its chill, whispered as they dispersed. Their sandals scuffed the dust, their voices hushed with dread. For if a man of such standing could be destroyed overnight, what shield remained for any other? Fear settled upon the city like a fog, thick and suffocating. Messalina, however, had made her point. She was no ornamental empress, no passive partner clinging to Claudius's shadow. She could decide the fate of men, and she could spill noble blood without hesitation. One rejection had led to one death, but it was only the beginning. In Rome, every act of power demanded a greater one to follow. And Messalina's hunger was far from sated. The execution of Silanus had shown Rome that Messalina's beauty was edged with steel, but power, once tasted, demanded more. She was not content with whispered influence. Her passions, mingled with ambition, drove her into pursuits both intimate and merciless. Those who caught her eye were as likely to become victims as lovers. Among them was Mnestor, a celebrated Greek actor whose performances drew gasps in Rome's crowded theaters. He was renowned for his grace, his movements fluid as though carved from water, his voice captivating audiences from the Subura to the Palatine. To many he was an artist. To Messalina he was prey. Summoned into her chambers, Mnestor found himself ensnared in a world of perfumed air and suffocating silk curtains. The scent of rosewater hung heavy, masking the danger beneath. Messalina's demands were not couched in affection but in threats. Comply, and he might live comfortably within her favor. Resist, and exile, or something far worse, would claim him. For Mnestor, survival meant obedience. Their encounters were not love but theater, a performance played in shadows, where the actor himself was forced into a role he could not refuse. But Messalina's appetites were not sated by coerced intimacy alone. Jealousy stirred her into darker acts. Her gaze turned upon Julia Livilla, sister of the late Caligula, a woman whose beauty rivaled her own. Julia had survived the fall of her brother's madness, and for that she carried a dangerous allure. To Messalina she was not merely competition for affection, she was a rival whose existence itself seemed intolerable. And so Messalina struck, wielding her influence like a blade. In 41 AD, Julia was accused of dishonor and treachery, charges sharpened by whispers Messalina herself had seeded. The punishment was exile to the barren isle of Pandateria, a place where the wind shrieked like a curse and the sea offered no mercy. There, stripped of power and comfort, Julia's beauty withered. Letters smuggled back by loyal slaves told of hunger, of hair turned ragged, of skin darkened and cracked beneath relentless sun. Rome heard these stories in fragments, but in them the cruelty of Messalina's vengeance was laid bare. Her jealousy had not merely banished a rival, it had condemned her to a living death. These episodes were not isolated. Each conquest, each exile, each silenced rival deepened the fear that hung over the palace. Senators lowered their eyes in her presence. Artists, slaves, and noblewomen alike trembled at the thought of her attention. Messalina's power was no longer just the influence of an empress beside a distracted emperor. It was the dominion of a woman who understood that love, when weaponized, could destroy more effectively than swords. She had become both Rome's most desired woman and its most dangerous predator. And the city, intoxicated by scandal and silenced by fear, could only watch as she tightened her grip. If Messalina's cruelty in the palace made Rome whisper, it was her rumored nights in the city's underbelly that made it gasp. For while by day she wore silk veils and jewels, seated beside the emperor in public ceremonies, by night she was said to cloak herself in anonymity and descend into the labyrinth of the Suburra, the quarter of Rome where shadows reigned and dignity was sold for coin. Juvenal, the satirist, claimed she went disguised as lasciva, a common prostitute, slipping into brothels where oil lamps smoked and straw pallets scratched the skin. There, among the stink of ale, sweat, and unwashed bodies, she mingled with the lowest men of Rome, her imperial rings concealed beneath a cheap cloak. Yet even hidden, her eyes burned with a hunger that betrayed her. The stories say she worked like any other prostitute, taking men one after another through the night, her purse filling with coin, though no wealth could sate her. At dawn she returned to the palace, limbs heavy, skin smudged with coal and ash, only to slip back into the silken role of Empress, Mother, and Augusta. Juvenal sneered that even after such nights she was unfulfilled, her appetite as insatiable as ever. One tale, elevated by Pliny the Elder, became legend, that in 48 AD Messalina challenged Sylla, a prostitute famed for her stamina, to a contest of endurance. Who, they asked, could take more lovers in a single day and night? The brothel's walls pulsed with the laughter and disbelief of the onlookers, but the Empress was undeterred. The contest began, and as the night dragged into dawn, Messalina emerged the victor, her tally 25 men. Her body ached, her breath ragged, but her pride unbowed. She, Rome's empress, had outlasted even the most hardened courtesan. To Rome's moralists, these stories were proof of a woman corrupted beyond measure. To her enemies they were weapons, slander sharpened to pierce her reputation. Tacitus himself cautioned that while Messalina's nature was reckless and cruel, the tales of her brothel escapades may have been magnified by enemies, most notably Agrippina, who would later rise as Claudius's new wife. Yet in Rome truth mattered less than perception. And the perception of an empress who prowled the streets at night, a creature of lust disguised in rags, was too scandalous for the city to forget. In the flickering light of history, it is difficult to separate myth from reality. But whether fact or fabrication, these stories capture something true about Messalina's reign, that she embodied Rome's contradictions, opulence and decay, majesty and depravity, the goddess Venus and the predator of the night, all in one body. And even as the city reeled from scandal, Messalina's other role, the mother, remained. For while the streets whispered of her midnight games, the palace still rang with the laughter of her children. And it was in that fragile balance between scandal and sanctuary that the next chapter of her story unfolded. For all the venom whispered about Messalina in Rome's taverns and senate halls, behind the palace gates there flickered another image of her, a mother, tender and fiercely protective of her children. In this role, she was not the predator of the Suburra or the schemer of palace intrigues, but a woman who sought, however imperfectly, to shield her young from the poison of the imperial court. Her son, Britannicus, bore the weight of expectation from the moment of his birth. Claudius adored the boy, seeing in him the continuation of the Julio-Claudian line, a legitimate heir whose name echoed the emperor's triumph in Britain. Within the palace gardens, Britannicus played like any child might, chasing lizards beneath laurel trees, plucking roses until his small hands were stained with petals. To him the world was still wide, still full of light. Yet even as he laughed, shadows gathered around him, because in Rome, a child born to power was never safe. Octavia, Messalina's daughter, was delicate, her dark eyes watchful in ways that belied her years. At only 6, she was already being woven into the machinery of alliances. In 41 AD, Messalina arranged for her betrothal to Lucius Junius Silanus, binding her daughter to one of Rome's most noble families. It was a match meant to fortify the family's future, to stitch her bloodline deeper into Rome's aristocracy. But in Rome, no bond was permanent, and even promises made in silk could unravel in blood. The palace itself was a paradox for these children, marble fountains splashing with cool water, gardens heavy with the scent of roses and pine, yet always threaded with whispers of betrayal. While the Subura echoed with the stories of Messalina's knights, the palace echoed with nursery songs, children's laughter, and her attempts to carve a sanctuary within walls that had seen too much blood. She may have been reckless with her desires, merciless with her enemies, but with her children she sought to build something softer, something enduring. Meanwhile, Claudius was far from Rome. In 43 AD he pursued the conquest of Britain, a campaign that would secure his name among emperors. Legionaries slogged through marshes, their boots sinking into mud as they raised standards under gray skies, their shouts carried on winds that reeked of salt and rain. Claudius, despite his frailties, stood at the head of this campaign, his presence lending authority to a conquest that would become his proudest achievement. But in his absence, Rome did not sleep. Messalina, still in her early 20s, was left with the empire's reins dangling loosely in her hands. She was Augusta, mother of the emperor's children, consort of the ruler of the known world, and she wielded that power with growing boldness. For every motherly smile given to Britannicus, every tender word whispered to Octavia, there was another face of Messalina, the one that courted danger, plotted in shadows, and sought pleasures that could undo dynasties. This duality was her truth. And it was only a matter of time before the balance between protector and predator collapsed, dragging her children and her empire into peril. By 48 AD, Messalina's shadow stretched long across Rome. She had maneuvered through scandal, silenced rivals, and cloaked herself in a dangerous duality, dutiful mother by day, predator by night. But her greatest folly, the seed of her ruin, took root in a man whose ambition matched her own, Gaius Silius. Silius was no ordinary senator. He was young, strikingly handsome, and of noble lineage, his presence in the forum turning heads with equal parts admiration and envy. The historian Tacitus hints that he was among the most desirable men of his time, admired for both his appearance and his stature in Rome's political sphere. To most he seemed destined for high office and a long, prosperous career. To Messalina he was something far more intoxicating, a chance to fuse desire with conspiracy. Their affair began in shadows, hidden behind the veils of palatial villas where ivy crept up marble columns and couches lay strewn with petals. Their bodies tangled in secrecy, their whispers laced not only with passion but with ambition. Silius, reckless in his own right, seemed drawn into Messalina's fire, as if the danger itself thrilled him. Tacitus would later suggest that it was not only lust that bound them, but the promise of power, for through Messalina Silius glimpsed the possibility of an empire. And for Messalina, this was no fleeting indulgence. She was still young, but she had tasted the intoxicating blend of influence and pleasure. Claudius, distant and distracted with his conquest of Britain and the minutiae of governance, offered stability but no fire. Silius was the opposite, youthful, ambitious, and reckless enough to dream of more than being her secret. Soon, the affair ceased to be a mere indulgence and began to look like an alliance. Their clandestine meetings became more brazen, their whispers more dangerous. In the flickering torchlight of secret feasts, Messalina imagined a new Rome, one where she would no longer hover in the shadow of Claudius but reign openly with Silius at her side. For him, she risked not only reputation but the empire itself. Tacitus records that Silius, in a desperate blend of devotion and audacity, urged Messalina to break free of the pretense. Let Claudius be discarded, let their union be made real, and let the empire bow to them. To most it would have seemed madness. To Messalina it was temptation. Thus, in the heat of desire and the blindness of ambition, they began to plot. What began as stolen nights had transformed into conspiracy, a dance that would soon summon Rome's most dangerous forces against them. The seed of ruin had been planted, and its bloom would choke them both. Claudius had gone to Ostia, the harbor city where grain ships arrived from across the Mediterranean. To the emperor, the trip was a routine duty, an inspection of Rome's lifeblood, the fleets that kept the capital fed. To Messalina, his absence was an opening, a span of days where she might indulge her desires without fear of his stammering voice or watchful freedmen. But what she chose to do in those days went far beyond indulgence. It was treason dressed as farce. In the autumn of 48 AD, Messalina and Gaius Silius staged a wedding. Not in secret, not in whispers, but in a blaze of drunken spectacle. The sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, recount the tale with tones of disbelief, as though they themselves could hardly trust the madness of it. A woman who was already Augusta, already the lawful wife of the emperor, donned the bridal veil once more, this time not beside Claudius but beside her lover. The ceremony unfolded like a parody of Roman tradition. Guests arrived wreathed in grapevines, their bodies flushed with wine, their laughter echoing through colonnades as flutes trilled into the night. Torches sputtered, casting erratic light on marble floors strewn with roses. Silius, radiant in his triumph, stood at Messalina's side while priests chanted as though this were a sacred union. She, veiled and radiant, laughed brightly, her eyes alive with reckless defiance. To those present, it must have felt like the world had turned upside down. Was this truly happening? Could the Empress of Rome, the mother of Britannicus and Octavia, stand before gods and men to marry another while Claudius yet lived? To some it was a grotesque comedy, to others, a harbinger of doom. Tacitus insists that this was no mere dalliance, but a deliberate bid for power. Silius, consul designate, had the nobility and ambition to rival senators. With Messalina, he gained proximity to imperial blood and perhaps even the chance to seize the purple for himself. Together they envisioned not secrecy but a coup, Rome reborn under their union, Claudius discarded like a relic of the past. The wedding feast roared late into the night. Goblets clinked, tables groaned under roasted meats and honeyed fruits, and drunken shouts filled the air. Amid the frenzy, Messalina's laughter rang like a challenge to the empire itself. She was daring the gods, daring the Senate, daring the Praetorians, daring even Claudius. But Rome was a city where walls had ears. Whispers escaped the villa, carried on the lips of servants, courtiers, and soldiers. Soon, the tale of the mock wedding reached ears that could not ignore it. Narcissus, Claudius's most loyal freedman, heard and knew instantly what it meant. Not scandal, but treason. And treason in Rome never ended with laughter. It ended in blood. When word of the mock wedding reached Narcissus, it was as though a torch had been flung into dry kindling. He understood instantly what others might still have dismissed as rumor. This was not mere scandal, not some whispered tale to be brushed aside. It was sedition, a direct threat to Claudius, to the dynasty, to the empire itself. And so, with the precision of a man who had survived long in the shadows, Narcissus rode hard for Ostia. The journey from Rome to the port was a blur of pounding hooves and dust-choked air. Narcissus, the freedman who had once been dismissed as a secretary, now carried the empire in his words. He reached Claudius by nightfall. The emperor, weary from inspecting grain ships, was roused from his chambers. There, in the flickering glow of oil lamps, Narcissus whispered the unthinkable, that his wife, the Augusta herself, had married another man. Claudius, startled and pale, could scarcely believe it. His stammered questions tumbled out, his face hollowed by betrayal. But Narcissus did not waver. He pressed the truth upon him with merciless clarity. Messalina's act was not a private indulgence, it was treason. If ignored, it could topple him from the throne. If acted upon, it might yet be contained. The emperor's carriage rattled back toward Rome under cover of night. The road was uneven, the wheels jolting over stone, the air thick with silence broken only by the clank of armed guards. Claudius sat within, his hands trembling, his eyes vacant. He was not a man of quick decisions or violent passions, but even he could feel the empire shifting beneath him. By dawn, the Praetorians had their orders. They stormed the house of Gaius Silius, where the remnants of the Bacchanal still lingered. Wine spilled across marble floors, goblets overturned, wilted garlands of roses perfuming the air with a sickly sweetness. Amid the debris of indulgence, they found evidence damning enough to silence all doubt. Imperial treasures, gifts from Messalina, proof of her betrayal scattered like discarded trinkets. Silius was seized. The once proud senator, his face drained of its youthful arrogance, was dragged through the streets to the prison. His pleas carried little weight now. he had gambled everything on the Empress's favor and lost. Within hours he was executed, his head struck from his body with the cold efficiency of Roman justice. Messalina, realizing too late that the game was lost, fled. She sought refuge in the gardens of Lucullus, those lush grounds lined with cypresses that swayed mournfully in the wind. There, among marble fountains and shaded paths, she wandered like a spectre, her silken garments tangled with branches, her hair undone. With her was her mother, Domitia Lepida, who pressed a dagger into her daughter's trembling hands. "Do it," Lepida urged, her voice low but fierce. "End it yourself and claim at least this one act of dignity." But Messalina faltered. The blade quivered in her grasp, her tears falling into the grass. For all her cunning, for all her ruthlessness, when the moment demanded steel in her own hand, she wavered. The Empress who had destroyed others with a glance could not destroy herself. The decision was taken from her. A tribune, sent by Claudius with soldiers at his side, stepped forward. His sword struck clean. Messalina's blood darkened the soil of the gardens. The life of Rome's most dangerous woman ended not in grandeur, but in silence beneath the cypresses. Back in the palace, Claudius dined as if nothing had passed. When asked about Messalina, he inquired faintly, his voice stripped of warmth as though grief had hollowed him, or perhaps as though he had none left to give. Soon after, the Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, her statues toppled, her name chiseled from monuments, her memory condemned to oblivion. But Rome did not forget. Rome never forgets. The Garden of Lucullus, usually a place of serenity, became Messalina's final stage. Its shaded paths, lined with whispering cypresses and fountains murmuring softly in the dawn air, bore witness to the collapse of an empress. She had once ruled Rome's palace with laughter, seduction, and fear, but now she wandered the grounds like a hunted animal, her silks torn by branches, her hair unbound, her face streaked with salt and dust. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, stood beside her, the voice of both pity and pragmatism. She pressed the dagger into her daughter's trembling hands, urging her to take control of her end. In Roman eyes, suicide was not only escape, it was dignity. To die by one's own hand was to deny one's enemies the satisfaction of striking the final blow. Even condemned senators and generals found a grim nobility in such an act. But Messalina, for all her ruthlessness in life, faltered in this final test of courage. The blade trembled in her grip, her tears falling upon it. She wept, not as an empress but as a woman undone, her ambition now ashes. It was then that the soldiers arrived. A tribune, dispatched by Claudius, stepped forward with his men. Tacitus describes the moment with chilling brevity. Messalina hesitated, her resolve broken, and so the tribune raised his sword. In a single motion he struck. Her blood soaked the garden's earth, mingling with the dew upon the grass. The empress who had once dared to rival Rome itself was gone, her final breath vanishing into the morning air. Back in the palace, Claudius was dining when news reached him. His reaction was muted, detached. "Is she dead?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of the rage or grief one might expect from a betrayed husband. Upon hearing confirmation he returned to his meal. It was as though she had never existed, as though the weight of years shared, children born, and power wielded meant nothing. Perhaps in that coldness lay the truest punishment of all, that even in death she found no mourning, only silence. The Senate moved swiftly. They issued the decree of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Messalina's statues were toppled, their marble faces shattering upon the stones. Her name was chiseled from inscriptions, erased from monuments, struck out as though Rome could unmake her by decree. The plazas echoed with the sound of falling stone, each crash a symbol of her obliteration. But erasure is never complete. Even as the Senate tried to scour her from memory, the people whispered her name. In taverns, in marketplaces, in the corners of patrician villas, her story was retold, of the empress who had ruled with beauty and cruelty, who had loved recklessly, who had dared to marry another while her husband still breathed. Memory cannot be destroyed by decree, and so Messalina lived on in fragments, in scandal, in satire, in whispered cautionary tales. For Rome, her death was not an end but a lesson. It revealed the fragility of power, the speed with which grandeur could collapse into disgrace, and the cold efficiency of an empire that consumed its own. Messalina's blood had fed the soil of Rome, but her shadow lingered still, haunting the marble halls where her laughter had once echoed. Messalina's fall might seem like the climax of a tale, an empress undone by her own hunger for power and pleasure. Her name was condemned, her statues toppled, her memory ordered into oblivion. Yet Rome's story did not end with her blood in the gardens of Lucullus. In truth, her destruction was only a fragment of a greater tapestry woven from ambition, corruption, and cruelty. For if Messalina embodied the excess of Rome's aristocracy, there were others, silent, nameless, who embodied its suffering. Look beyond the marble halls, past the banquets where goblets clinked, past the whispered intrigues of senators and freedmen. In the shadows, in the rooms where lamps burned low, lived the delicati, the boys whose lives were consumed by Rome's appetite for pleasure and domination. Their stories are harder to tell, for they left no statues, no inscriptions carved in stone, only fragments preserved in satire, whispers, and moral laments. Yet in many ways they tell us more about Rome's soul than any empress or emperor. These were not ordinary slaves, nor the hardened laborers who worked Rome's fields and mines. They were captives, often no older than 10, taken from the marketplaces of Alexandria, Gaul, or Judea. Fair-haired Germans, dark-eyed Syrians, olive-skinned Greeks, all became part of the empire's human commerce. Their youth was their currency, their beauty their curse. For Rome's elite, these boys were tokens of prestige. To own such a child was to flaunt wealth and power, to display not only the spoils of conquest but the ability to shape flesh itself into an object of desire. They were groomed, perfumed, dressed in soft tunics. In public they poured wine at feasts, their eyes lowered, their smiles brittle. In private, their roles darkened into submission, their bodies demanded as offerings to masters whose whims were law. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, none wrote extensively of them, for their suffering was so commonplace that it barely registered as remarkable. But in satire, in the margins of moral philosophy, their presence emerges. Seneca, in a letter to Lucilius, lamented the cruelty of masters who trained boys to endure nightly torment, their forced laughter masking terror. Petronius, in his Satyricon, depicted them circulating at feasts, their smiles brittle, their bruises hidden beneath silk. Even graffiti on the walls of Pompeii, names, crude jokes, pleas carved in haste, bears witness to their despair. Messalina's scandal shocked Rome because it was spectacle, an empress turned prostitute, an imperial wife marrying her lover. But the delicati did not shock. Their suffering was routine, as common as bread baked in the Subura's ovens. Rome consumed them silently, night after night, year after year. If Messalina's downfall showed the dangers of excess among the powerful, the plight of the delicati revealed something deeper, darker, that Rome's very foundations were built not only on conquest and ambition, but on bodies treated as property, voices silenced before they could cry out. The empire that raised aqueducts and amphitheaters also raised children for sacrifice, sacrifices not to gods, but to the endless hunger of men. In the bustling markets of Rome and its provinces, where traders hawked olives, silks, and amphorae of wine, another form of commerce thrived, one more silent, more chilling. Beneath awnings stretched tight against the Mediterranean sun, children were bought and sold as though they were livestock. Their hair was examined like the fleece of sheep, their teeth pried open like horses, their bodies prodded as though they were commodities rather than human beings. These were the delicati, the delicate ones, chosen not for strength or skill but for beauty, softness, and submission. Many came from Rome's conquests, fair-skinned boys from Gaul with hair the color of wheat, dark-eyed captives from Judea, pale youths dragged from the forests of Germania. Torn from families, they were groomed to please Rome's elite. Once purchased, they were taken into baths where steam rose in thick clouds, their hair combed with perfumed oils, their bodies rubbed until their skin gleamed under torchlight. They were dressed in fine tunics, trained to walk gracefully, to pour wine without spilling, to smile when commanded, to suppress every instinct of fear. Their value was not measured in their labor but in their ability to adorn feasts, to amuse their masters, and to endure what followed after the feasts had ended. In the villas of patricians, they stood among mosaics of gods, carrying trays of figs and honey, their bare feet whispering across the marble. Guests would comment on their beauty as casually as they might on a fine tapestry or a well-bred horse. The boys themselves, silent, became part of the scenery, objects to be admired, passed around, or discarded. On the island of Capri, this economy reached grotesque extremes. When Emperor Tiberius withdrew there in 27 AD, he filled his villa perched above the sea cliffs with troops of such boys. Suetonius writes that they were trained to swim and dive, their bodies glistening as they performed in grottos where water dripped from limestone ceilings. Some were forced into tableaus of myth, living imitations of nymphs and satyrs, arranged like sculptures for the emperor's gaze. Torchlight shimmered on oiled skin, the air heavy with incense, the sea roaring endlessly below like some vast beast echoing their captivity. But the grooming and the spectacle masked an unrelenting brutality. Castration was common. A surgeon's knife, cold and merciless, robbed them of manhood, their screams swallowed by stone walls. Those who survived were forced to heal in silence, their bodies mutilated to preserve a certain softness that Rome's elite demanded. Weeks in darkened cells followed, the pain lingering like a phantom that never left. The boys lived with constant terror, for defiance was met with lashes, and disobedience could mean death or banishment to the mines, where darkness crushed both body and spirit. To survive, they performed obedience, their hands steady as they poured wine, their lips curved in brittle smiles, their eyes downcast. But inside, dread gnawed at them like a constant hunger. To the aristocracy, they were status symbols, living ornaments that testified to their master's wealth and taste. To the boys themselves, life was a chain with no key, each day endured in silence. Their beauty, praised and paraded, was also their sentence. In the heart of Rome, where senators debated and poets sang, the delicati moved like shadows, present everywhere, yet acknowledged by none. Their suffering, unlike Messalina's scandals, did not draw satire or outrage. It was normalized, embedded in the very rhythm of Roman life, as routine as feasting, as invisible as the hands that cleaned the marble floors after the banquets ended. This was Rome's other empire, not the empire of legions and marble but of flesh and fear. Rome's empire was not only built on stone and conquest, it was sustained by silence. The cries of the delicati rarely reached the Senate, the Forum, or the ears of those who might have acted. Yet fragments remain, scattered like broken pottery across the texts of Rome's philosophers, satirists, and poets. These voices, sometimes mocking, sometimes sorrowful, hint at the hidden torments endured by the boys trapped in Rome's empire of flesh. Juvenal, sharp-tongued and merciless in his satires, sneered at Rome's obsession with soft-skinned youths. He mocked senators who paraded boys, smoother than a woman's thigh, their cheeks kept hairless by the knife or the pumice stone. The tone was scornful, but beneath the venom lingered recognition. These boys were not companions but possessions. Martial, in his epigrams, describes gifts exchanged among Rome's wealthy, goblets of silver, exotic birds, and sometimes boys. His casual words sting with their normalization. A boy, as easily offered as jewelry, became a currency of intimacy, a token of status. Their humanity vanished under the ink of wit. Yet not all voices treated them as ornaments. Seneca, the philosopher who lived through Tiberius's reign, wrote bitterly of luxury and excess. He condemned the patricians who demanded from children the pleasures of men, who trained innocence into servitude. His stoic words suggested that Rome's moral corruption was reflected not only in gold and banquets but in the bodies it consumed. Later, Christian writers, Tertullian, Jerome, Augustine, would look back on Rome with horror. To them, the delicati were symbols of a society given over to lust and cruelty, where innocence was desecrated in the name of power. They denounced not only the practice but the silence of a people who accepted it as the way of the world. But the most haunting testimonies are not in philosophy or satire, they are in absence. We hear nothing from the boys themselves. No letters survive, no memoirs, no songs written in the quiet of night. Their voices were smothered before they could ever be recorded. Theirs is a history written by others, told only in fragments, in sneers, in moral condemnations, or in whispers of scandal. And yet, silence itself is a record. It tells us that they were not allowed to speak, not allowed to exist as subjects in their own stories. Their lives were measured only by the desires of others. If Rome's monuments were built of stone, the delicati remind us they were also built of stolen youth. For every arch and forum that still stands, there are lives erased, unwritten stories carried away by the Tiber's current, washed into the sea. The mock wedding had been reckless, but Messalina believed herself untouchable. For years she had bent Rome's nobility to her will, toppled rivals, and wrapped Claudius in a web of devotion and fear. She trusted in her beauty, her children, and her ability to charm the emperor into blindness. Yet in the autumn of 48 AD her illusions shattered. The news of her union with Gaius Silius spread like fire. At first, Claudius refused to believe it. How could his wife, the mother of Britannicus, stand in the eyes of Rome and marry another while he yet lived? To him it must have sounded like slander, the whispers of jealous courtiers. But Narcissus, his most loyal freedman, pressed the truth upon him. He described the ceremony, the guests, the drunken revelry, and the priests who had dared to bless a union that mocked the emperor's authority. Claudius's face turned pale, his stammer sharper than ever. This was no mere affair, it was treason, an act that declared him weak and replaceable. If Messalina and Silius succeeded, the Senate could be swayed, the Praetorians could shift allegiance, and Claudius himself might find his throne, and his life, snatched away. Silius, realizing too late that their game had turned to fire, urged Messalina to act quickly. He counseled that they should seize Claudius at Ostia, to strike before the emperor could act. But hesitation destroyed them. Messalina lingered, caught between desperation and the hope that she could still twist Claudius's heart. Meanwhile, Narcissus moved with ruthless speed. He rushed to Claudius, warning him that hesitation meant death. Then, with soldiers at his back, he led the emperor to the Praetorian camp. There Claudius, trembling, bewildered, stood before the guards. They too had heard of Messalina's madness. When Narcissus laid bare the truth, their loyalty shifted. Claudius was still emperor. Silius was merely a usurper clothed in arrogance. At Narcissus's urging, Claudius ordered the arrest of Silius and all who had taken part in the mock wedding. The lover did not resist. Knowing the game was lost, he asked only for a quick death. And Rome, eager to be rid of him, obliged. Messalina, however, was not so easily extinguished. She fled the palace, racing through gardens and villas, seeking refuge among friends who now shrank from her. The Empress who once commanded terror now found doors closed, allies vanished. Abandoned, she sought out her mother, Lepida. In tears, she begged for guidance. For a moment, Lepida, who had long disapproved of her daughter's cruelty, relented. She held the broken woman in her arms, whispering words of comfort. But comfort was a luxury too late. Narcissus had already sent soldiers. As Claudius dined in ignorance, uncertain and pliant, Messalina waited in the gardens of her estate, her hair disheveled, her spirit broken. She asked for an audience with her husband, desperate to plead her case. But Narcissus, fearing Claudius's softness, denied her the chance. He knew that if Messalina's voice reached the emperor's ears, pity might win. And pity, Narcissus swore, could not be allowed. The Praetorians advanced, swords gleaming. Messalina clutched the dagger offered to her, her hands trembling. Suicide was the Roman way, the last dignity for the disgraced. But she could not bring herself to strike. Her courage, so fierce in plotting, failed in the face of steel. And so, it was the centurion's blade that finished her. The Empress of Rome, once untouchable, lay dead among roses in the garden, her body cooling beneath the autumn sky. When word reached Claudius, he did not speak of her again. Messalina is dead, Narcissus told him. The emperor nodded slowly as though relieved of a burden and turned back to his meal. Rome moved on, its empire unmoved by the fall of one woman. But in whispers, in rumors, in the stories of courtiers and enemies, her name lived on. Messalina, the empress who mocked her marriage vows, who wielded beauty as a weapon, and whose lust and ambition ended in blood. Messalina's death should have ended her story. In the annals of emperors, one disgraced empress might have been forgotten, her memory dissolved like so many others consumed by Rome's endless appetite for scandal. Yet Messalina did not vanish. Instead, her name became a shadow cast across generations, a symbol whispered in fear, invoked in scorn, remembered in fascination. In the months following her execution, Rome sought to cleanse itself of her influence. Statues were pulled down, her images defaced, her allies condemned. The Senate passed decrees to erase her name from records, to pretend she had never existed. But such erasure only sharpened curiosity. What kind of woman could provoke such wrath? What secrets of the court had been hidden beneath her beauty? For those who hated her, Messalina became the embodiment of corruption. To moralists, she was a warning of unbridled female desire, a woman who had transgressed every limit, defied every tradition, and paid the price. To satirists and poets, she was a figure ripe for exaggeration, her lust inflated to monstrous proportions, her hunger for men and power painted in strokes so wild that myth blurred with memory. And yet, beneath the venom, there lingered another vision. For some, Messalina was not merely a monster but a mirror of Rome itself. The empire in its splendor was also insatiable, consuming wealth, lands and lives without end. Was Messalina's excess truly her own, or was she simply the reflection of an age addicted to indulgence? Her son Britannicus, the boy she had once championed, never wore the purple. Nero, the stepson she had tried to eclipse, claimed the throne instead. Britannicus died young, poisoned under mysterious circumstances. Another shadow of the palace intrigues Messalina had once mastered. Claudius, for his part, remarried. Agrippina the younger, ambitious and cunning, stepped into the role Messalina left vacant. Where Messalina had ruled through desire, Agrippina ruled through intellect and iron. The cycle of influence, of women bending emperors to their will, continued. Rome, it seemed, was never free of Messalina's ghost. Over centuries her legend grew. Medieval chroniclers retold her story as a cautionary tale of lust. Renaissance painters portrayed her as both temptress and tragedy, draped in silk, eyes blazing with forbidden power. Even in modern tongues her name lingers, Messalina, as shorthand for the woman who desires too much, who schemes too boldly, who oversteps the line drawn by men. And yet, one must ask, who was the real Messalina? Was she the monster penned by her enemies, the devourer of men painted by satirists? Or was she a young woman, an empress married at 15, thrust into a world of power games, forced to wield her beauty because it was the only weapon Rome allowed her? Perhaps the truth lies between legend and reality. Messalina was neither saint nor mere caricature. She was human, flawed, ambitious, hungry for love, power, and pleasure. And like so many who reached too far in the Roman court, she fell when her reach exceeded the patience of those around her. But her story, tragic and electric, did not die in that garden. It lived on in whispers, in texts, in the imagination of every age that followed. And in those echoes Messalina became immortal, not through honor, not through triumph, but through infamy.